Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.
Hello and welcome everyone to Read Smart, the official podcast of the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction. Today you join us as we meet each of the shortlisted authors for the 2025 award in the lead up to the announcement of this year's winner on the 4th of November. As always, we're very grateful to the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its generous support of this podcast. Our guest today is Adam Weymouth, a writer and journalist whose latest book, Lone Wolf, Walking the Faultlines of Europe, is a finalist for this year's award. Adam's first book, Kings of the Yukon, charted a 4-month voyage down the Yukon River following the path of migrating salmon, exploring their interconnectedness with local life. For this, Adam was awarded the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year Award, the Edward Stanford Lonely Planet Adventure Travel Book of the Year Award, and the Prix Paul Émile Victor. He has also been named by the National Writing Centre as one of the 10 writers shaping the UK's future. In Lone Wolf, Adam recreates the real epic journey undertaken by a real wolf called Schlouts across the European continent. He tracked Schlouts using GPS on a 1,000-mile journey in 2011 from Slovenia to northern Italy, where the wolf population has since grown from 0 to something like 130. It's a story that explores rewilding and the relationship between humans and nature and the fault lines in a changing Europe. This year's judges have described Lone Wolf as terrific. They praised its great cast of characters and called it a beautiful book. Thank you, Adam, for joining us, and many congratulations on being a finalist for this year's award.
Thank you, Toby. I'm so pleased to be here.
So, when did you first encounter Schlouts' journey, and what inspired you to write about it?
I think it began when I came back. Like you said, my first book was about Alaska, and when I came back from Alaska, I was living out on the west coast of Scotland, and I missed Alaska with the acuteness of a homesickness when I came back. I'd never been anywhere like it, but living on the west coast of Scotland, like I could almost convince myself I was back there in the landscapes and this sort of anarchic, self-sufficient spirit people had. But I started wondering what had happened to all the large carnivores, all these animals that I'd got used to seeing in Alaska, not just the wolf, but the bear, the lynx, the wolverine. They're all animals that used to be in the UK once upon a time. And the more I read about it, I realised that there's a similar story, almost as in so many ways, Alaska was kind of an outlier. Really large carnivores have been persecuted across the entire range, and the wolf, which is the animal that people have always found the hardest to love, have been persecuted the most of all. So that was kind of the seed of it, and I then read a very small article about this wolf that had done this journey, this 1,000-mile walk across the Alps with a GPS collar on it, and it was when I saw the line on the map, it was almost kind of calling out to me to follow it.
So tell us about the life of a modern European wolf. What does it comprise? What does it feel like to be a modern European wolf these days?
I imagine it feels pretty good, to be honest. Really, ever since we switched from a hunter-gatherer to a farming lifestyle, we've persecuted wolves. Wolves have been persecuted ever since there's been money out, since there's been currencies to pay the bounties, right back to kind of ancient Greece. There used to be the most widespread non-domesticated land mammal on the entire planet. For more than 1 million years, they completely dominated the Northern Hemisphere. And by the middle of the 20th century, we'd basically pushed them almost to extinction across their entire range. But amazingly, as an environmental journalist, I'm used to covering quite a lot of stories that feel quite hopeless. But for the wolf, this wasn't the final act. The wolf, since the sort of 1960s in Europe, has begun this remarkable resurgence. In the last 2 or 3 decades, it's really become exponential. Their numbers have gone up by about 2,000% since the 1960s. And that's across the entirety of mainland Europe. The islands, we're one of sort of 5 islands in Europe that don't have wolves back. Every single other country in Europe now has wolves back, and they've done it entirely by themselves. There's no way that they've been reintroduced. And that is partly because some of them are hardwired to disperse in this way, to head off on these amazing journeys. What was amazing about Schlouts is partly how successful he ended up being, and also that he'd been collared before he set out. So for the first time, we had this amazing insight of how this wolf was moving across this landscape, which in many ways is not the sort of wild, remote, mountainous landscape that we think of when we picture a wolf, but a lot of it is really quite a human-dominated landscape. And the chance to see that and to see how wolves interact with people was an amazing chance that hadn't existed up till then.
Yeah, and I think in the popular imagination, wolves exist in packs, but Schnauz is quite a solitary animal in these vast peripatetic journeys that he undertakes, isn't he?
Well, for this moment, for these 4 months when he's on the journey, yeah. And actually, that was one of the reasons that I wanted to call the book Lone Wolf, because, we have this idea of a sort of lone wolf as this kind of Clint Eastwood character riding off into the sunset, doesn't need anyone. And I think in my 20s, I had a bit of a tendency to think of myself as a bit of a lone wolf character, to my shame now, because what I realized doing this walk is a lone wolf does not intend to remain as a lone wolf. There's no more dangerous time for a wolf, which is meant to be part of a pack, to be by himself or herself. And really, a lone wolf is just looking for the same three things that we're all looking for, really, which is enough space to live, enough food to eat, and a mate.
And was there what was guiding Schnauz's journey? What was there? Can you discern a principle that guided his route?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's the sort of scientific take. So wolves are one of the first things to say is this idea of an alpha wolf is completely discounted now in the science. It's something that's really persisted in the sort of toxic corners of the internet, because I think if we can believe that wolves behave like this, then we can justify our own behavior as well. But a wolf pack is not dominated by an alpha male ruling over this kind of harem of females and being deposed by other males. A wolf pack is essentially a family. And because wolves are very confined to a territory, at some point, some of the offspring are going to need to head out by themselves and establish other territories just because they run out of space. So there is this sense, despite wolves being incredibly conservative creatures, incredibly hard to hunt, to trap, to see even.
Even to put a GPS device on.
And particularly to put a GPS device on. I go into the book about just how difficult they are to trap, to put these collars on. They're driven by this other instinct as well, which is to pioneer new lands, to head out, to find a mate, to start new packs. And it is thanks to that other quality and then this sort of desire for life to thrive, which means that wolves have been so successful in recolonizing Europe. And so that's kind of the science. And Schnauz had been well studied. It's worth saying that that there was this amazing data set of his journey across Europe, and there'd been a lot of academic papers about him, but no one had done a journey like I'd done. And so there was something interesting in however clumsily, but sort of putting myself in the footsteps behind the eyes of a wolf, and doing that journey, starting to try and understand some of the reasons that he made the decisions that he did, that he took the path that he did, that he stopped where he chose to.
Yeah, I can see that. And in terms of the status of wolves in terms of their protected nature, what is the current status of wolves, or what was the status of Schnauz when he was undertaking his epic journey, and has that changed now?
It has, yes, recently, very recently. So one of the reasons for the wolves' resurgence has been conservation measures put in place by the EU over the last 30 years or so. The Habitats Directive that was signed in 1992 has really facilitated the spread of wolves across Europe, not just because of the kind of joined up conservation measures, but also because scientists have been able to share knowledge across borders. And it's been a remarkable success. That was up until 2 years ago, when a wolf made the strategically terrible mistake of eating Ursula von der Leyen's favourite pony. It was the president of the EU Commission.
Which is like something from a satirical novel.
I know. Ursula von der Leyen is a very passionate equestrian, apparently, and she, on the back of that, she ordered a review, which has led to just this summer the status of the wolf being downgraded from strictly protected to protected. And I look in the book, in some ways it's not a terrible thing. And I'm sure we'll come on to talk about this, but one of the things that I felt from doing this journey and using it as a way to talk to shepherds, to hunters, was this real anger in the countryside of the fact that these wolves are back and clearly they're doing quite well, and people aren't allowed to do anything about it in the way that their great-grandparents were allowed to. And it's almost that impotence in the face of the wolf's return. And I really understand why people feel threatened by it. It's not being allowed to do anything about it that's almost inflaming that anger more than anything. The worry is that when you give a little bit, then it allows these laws to be continually eroded, and it is very much a political decision. And as we've seen in so many ways, making sort of scientific choices based on politics doesn't end that well. And so we've really entered a whole new chapter. One of the things I say in the book is that I feel like our relationship with the wolf is probably one of the world's oldest culture wars, and we've really just entered a new chapter on that this summer.
Yeah, I love that phrase. So let's talk a little bit more about that before we talk about your life as a writer. So on the one hand, there's a sort of understandable reaction by farmers who without them being consulted to the reintroduction of these animals, which presumably are quite keen on feasting on their flocks. What kind of destruction can an adult wolf wreak on a flock of sheep?
It's disproportionate. So taken as a whole, if you look at the number of sheep that have been killed in Italy this year, it's not much when you compare it to lightning strikes or falling off a cliff or disease. But it's the disproportionate, the fact that a pack of wolves. I met farmers in Slovenia that had lost 120 sheep over the course of one summer. So if a wolf pack is targeting your flock, it can be catastrophic.
Yes. And the resentment, to tell us a little bit more about the resentment felt by those farmers and how that's being exploited by sort of populists and right-wing parties.
These farmers are already, and the farmers we're talking about here are not massive agribusinesses. They're small-scale farmers that are practicing fairly traditional methods. They've got very used to sending their sheep or their goats or their cows up into the mountain pastures for the summer and then rounding them up and bringing them back down in the autumn time. So they're living hard lives in hard places. And the year that I did the walk, it was the driest summer in Europe for 500 years. The drought was making lives incredibly difficult. Russia had just invaded Ukraine, which meant that the price of electricity, the price of animal feed was rocketing. Young people don't want to farm anymore. Most farmers I met were kind of 70 plus because the young people are leaving for the cities. So people are already struggling, and they're now being asked to live alongside wolves as well. So I could understand their anger. And it's quite hard to go out and do something about the common agricultural policy, but it's quite easy to go out and shoot a wolf, albeit illegally. So I got this sense that wolves were being scapegoated for this much more complicated range of problems. I was told, well, the young people don't want to farm anymore because their sheep are going to get eaten by a wolf. But obviously that's a small part of a much bigger problem. But what I saw was that I met certain farmers, certain shepherds that were taking, it is possible to live alongside wolves, it is possible to coexist. And I met people that were using electric fences, that are using guardian dogs to protect their flocks. But quite often those people are being treated as traitors by their neighbours, because doing those things to protect your flock is tantamount to accepting that the wolf is back. And what I saw amongst local politicians, particularly with the Freedom Party of Austria, but in Slovenia and Italy as well, is that far-right politicians are telling farmers not to protect their flocks, almost to encourage the carnage, to create the chaos, which then enables them both to go to Brussels and say we need to change in the law, and to use that anger to chase that sort of populist vote in the countryside, which we've seen with across the board with farmers' protests, that legitimate concerns that farmers have are being piggybacked on by a certain type of politician in order to chase that rural vote.
Yeah, fascinating. In 2010, you walked from England to Istanbul, and then for your book, Kings of Yukon, you took a 2,000-mile canoe trip across Canada and Alaska, and in Lone Wolf, you walk merely 1,000 miles in the footsteps of a wolf. Tell us about that immersion in the outdoors and in the landscape, and why you make those choices and what you hope to achieve by them.
I think it gives you a very different perspective. It was very clear to me when I was working in Alaska. The first time I was in Alaska, it was 2013. I was there as a journalist writing stories about oil extraction and climate change. And I would catch these little bush planes into a village, spend a day trying to interview people, found them very inhospitable environments. There's a lot of bad blood. There's a long tradition of white people turning up in these indigenous villages and often not having, taking something, whether it's whalers or police officers or whatever it is. There's a lot of history there, and I found it a very hard environment to work in. And so when I went back to write Kings of the Yukon, doing that canoe trip, engaging in the lands, kind of traveling slowly, I felt just opened people up in a completely different way. I think people appreciated that I was taking more time, that I was really trying to get to know the area. And I ended up being passed along this sort of grapevine. I would meet someone and they would want to know how the fishing was going upriver. And then when I'd chat to them, they'd say, oh, well, you have to go and stay with my cousin in the next village down. And so I became sort of part of the story of the river. And I just found that people opened up in this completely different way. And so it was something that I was interested to try for this book as well, partly in order to open up those relationships with the characters. And again, a lot of the book focuses on those characters. There's voices that often get overlooked. I'm talking to hunters and hill farmers and people like that aren't necessarily so comfortable with a journalist just kind of popping up in their house and, saying they've got half an hour and they need to hear this and this. And it was also an interest, like I said at the beginning, about actually doing that same journey that Schloss did. There were lots of moments before I began the walk where I transferred all the GPS points onto my maps, and he would make these decisions that I couldn't quite understand, that he was sort of heading on one trajectory and then suddenly he'd shoot off in a different direction. But I realised when I actually did the walk that, well, the place that he changed direction was the first place that you could hear the airport from, or I'd reached a mountain pass that when I was on the ground seemed completely impassable. So there was a sense of actually doing that walk in his footsteps that allowed me to understand some of the decisions that he was making. And I also just think it improves the writing, when I'm walking in a forest for 6 hours or whatever it is. But partly it's thinking about the descriptive side of it, but it also helps me work through the ideas and in a way that I find really hard when I'm just sitting at a desk. And I enjoy it, I'd be a fool to say I don't also. It's not also just a great job.
And do you write as you go? Are you writing paragraphs and pages as you go along, or are you?
Yeah. I try and write as much. Actually, for this one, I kept a little dictaphone in my pocket as well, just to avoid sort of having to take my bag off. And for Kings of the Yukon, which I did with my wife a lot of the trip as well, who's since become my wife. So I'd often be sitting in the front of the canoe kind of scribbling while she'd be sitting in the back paddling. Often it is kind of at the end of a long day, once you've sort of put the tent up and made dinner, it is often the last thing that I want to do late at night is to write notes for hours. But I've really found over the course of doing this that the details that really make a description or something a character said, it gets lost so incredibly quickly that if I can't get it down kind of that day, then it's sort of lost for good. So it's I find often the best writing is the writing that I do right then.
I can imagine. And if you fast forward in a decade's time, who are some of the people and what are some of the places you think you'll look back on as the most indelible of this journey?
I think particularly in Licinia, because so Schloss finished his journey in Licinia. That's where he bumped into a wolf that ended up being called Juliet, who was on a walkabout of her own. And where they bred for the first time. I went back to Licinia many times over the course of a year in order to see how that particular part of Italy was changing with the return of the wolf, which meant I just got to know so many people. There's Mattia and Sophia, this young couple of shepherds who are trying to show that it is possible to live alongside wolves. This amazing man in his 80s called Modesto, who's still the last person that does the traditional transhumance, where he walks with his cows down out of the mountains each autumn. I just felt so welcomed there. And we're actually going back this October for the first time, going back with my wife and kids to visit some of those people. So I hope that is a place that... And also, it's nice to start hearing that feedback. I got an email this week from a man in Slovenia who breeds horses, who lost one of his best horses to a bear, who was incredibly skeptical about my purpose. And often I felt like I was kind of the ambassador for the wolf. But he wrote to me this week saying that he really enjoyed the book and it was very balanced and he felt it was really sort of represented the problems that they had. So those sort of relationships that continue to endure feel really important. And I hope, means the book has a wider purpose that's not just sort of entertaining people in the UK, but part of the intention of the book is to try and help have these complicated conversations about how people and wolves can coexist.
And there's wonderful cultural and social history in the book as well. I mean, did you were you doing the research before you went, or were you painting it in afterwards, or as you went along, or all of the above?
Yeah, yeah, all of the above, basically. So for example, I realised before I set out that Schloutz was going to walk through 2 towns in Austria where people have been put to death for being werewolves as late as the 18th century. Which then it was a couple of miles off the route, but it felt good enough to do a detour, and then coming back did a lot more research afterwards about the history of the werewolf trials in Europe, which I knew nothing about. The witch trials has been quite well covered the last few years, but there was this other hysteria at the same time about people being accused of being werewolves and also put to death in and again, scapegoats, really often outsiders who were made to stand in for these much more complicated problems that places were having.
You mentioned Juliet earlier, but tell us what happened when Schloutz met Juliet.
So Juliet was not wearing a tracking collar, so where she began her walkabout from is a bit more unclear. They think, looking at her genetics, she probably came from somewhere on the French-Italian border. But wherever she came from, somehow in thousands of square miles of space, these 2 wolves managed to bump into each other. And Luca, who's one of the forest rangers in Lycinia, told me about this moment when he saw their tracks meeting in the snow for the first time, and how you could tell from the way that the tracks overlapped and how they were playing and tumbling over each other. Neither of them would have seen another wolf for 4 or 5 months. They could have been forgiving that they were the only wolf left on the planet. And the fact that they found each other and then liked each other and started and formed a first pack, and that was 12 years ago now. There are now up to 17 packs in the whole of the northeast Italian Alps that have come from their descendants, and then other wolves moving in. So it's the legacy of those 2 journeys. Schlautz's journey is amazing, Juliet's journey is amazing, but what's really incredible is that legacy of those 2 journeys that has really completely altered the ecosystem of these mountains back to how it was hundreds of years ago.
And how improbable is it that they should meet each other, or are they transmitting signals to other wolves wherever they go?
People explain it to you. You can hear a wolf howl from about 10 miles away. They leave scent markings. There is a sense of, probably easier than it would be for me and you to find each other in the Alps. But I think there's something quite magical to me to even come within that vicinity of each other. There's something there that still feels inexplicable to me. The fact that they even got within 10 miles of each other, the fact that, that I find astonishing.
It sounds, it's wonderful and romantic and extraordinary. Mm. And tell us about the time you met a wolf yourself.
Yeah, so there's this amazing research centre just outside of Vienna, which I was told about. I met a farmer in the Austrian Alps, and she told me that in a previous life she'd worked at this place called the Wolf Research Centre. And she was fascinated for having this kind of foot in both worlds, that she was a farmer and she'd married a farmer and was trying to encourage her partner to put fences up to sort of protect their cows from wolves. But she came from this other place where she did a PhD in the spatial awareness of wolves. And this centre, which I then went to visit, has been set up essentially to raise wolves and dogs outside in packs in identical ways, bottle fed from birth, with the intention of trying to understand, if you balance out for the nurture, essentially, how does the nature of a wolf and a dog differ, which are genetically basically identical. And they found in lots of ways that wolves and dogs differ. Dogs like to be led. Dogs in many ways have been described as sort of juvenile wolves which have never grown up. They like to be led by someone else, whereas a wolf will not accept that. A wolf likes to be on a kind of level pegging in the hierarchy and sometimes likes to take the lead. A dog will understand if there's food on the table, that's your food, whereas a wolf is never going to accept that. So there's this amazing kind of experimental archaeology going on, basically, that's looking about how wolves became to be domesticated. And I was lucky enough to be invited into one of these enclosures of this old wolf called Wombly, who's been there for about 12 years when I met him. And it was an uncanny, amazing experience to meet this animal, which in many ways you feel like you understand. They wag their tail and they prick their ears and they have the same behaviors that you've seen in any dog you've ever met. But there is something foreign in them as well. There's something other that feels impossible to penetrate and understand. Really, still the presence of being in it with a very wild animal is something that really stayed with me.
And what impact are you hoping for in the readers of Lone Wolf? What do you want them to take away from the book, if you like?
I've tried very hard to preserve that balance, and one of the most gratifying things that I've had from the feedback is that sense of balance, is really trying to understand that other point of view. I was meeting a lot of people who I disagreed with, not necessarily in terms of whether we should have wolves back in Europe, because on that I do think it's an incredibly complex question. But I was meeting people who I really disagreed with in terms of how they think about migration and how they think about land use and all these things. But I do think the only I think the value that a book can provide over all the other sorts of media that we're kind of having thrust down our necks every minute of the day now is to engage with those really complex questions, and is to try and give voices to those people that are getting overlooked. And people ask me if I think we should have wolves back in Britain. I think it's a very complicated question. I think it's a useful question to talk about, because I think it asks us what we mean when we talk about rewilding, and what we mean when we say that we need to give more space to nature. But really, I don't think it can possibly work here until we have those difficult conversations with people that are living on the land. I did a long walk across Scotland a few years ago to ask people there how they'd feel about having wolves back. And what I heard from people living on the land is when they hear people talking about rewilding, really what they hear is people talking about the clearances, and it's an extension of the clearances. It's just another reason to get people off the land in order for people in the cities to, once upon a time they wanted sheep, now they want wolves. But qualitatively, it's not that different. It's still people in the cities making the choices for people that live on the land. And while people are still feeling like that, I don't think it's ever going to work. There's a huge mess in Colorado at the moment where wolves have been brought back. They had a referendum, 51% for, 49% against, and it's a disaster for the people living on the land. It's also a disaster for the wolves, because the wolves are being poisoned and poached, and so if anything, it's encouraging people to have those nuanced, complex debates. I think that's what I'd like people to take away from it.
Yeah, that's a brilliant answer. I think books are sort of the only medium of thick description we have, really. And if you create a thick description of anything, you really end up having to read or write a book, because we've got no other means of creating such thick descriptions. No, it's true. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Adam, for joining us. That was a wonderful conversation. Very, very best of luck in the final round of the prize.
Thank you, Toby.
We'd like to thank again the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its continued and generous support of this podcast. As I said at the top of the podcast, the winner of the Baillie Gifford Prize 2025 will be announced on the 4th of November at an awards ceremony in London. That ceremony is also generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. The announcement will be live streamed across the Baillie Gifford Prize non-fiction social channels. If you're interested in finding out more about the shortlisted books or following the progress in the prize more generally, do please visit our website or follow us on X, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok on @BGPrize. Thanks for listening. Until next time.
Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.